there is a philosophy that each of us are in drag because we are all playing roles at times. The word drag itself, literally, it means to put on. So what are we putting on when we enter the various spaces of our lives?
Wow.
We put on drag when we are with our families. We put on drag when we attend a church service. We put on drag when we go to the airport. So the ways in which we present to the world of what they want them to see, because drag is face. Like, you are projecting something for folks to see.
Welcome to the podcast, Tapping Creativity, with myself, Matthew C. Temple. And each week, we're going to dive into questions and issues and inspiration around creativity and the creative process. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Tapping Creativity. And I'm super excited today because I have a really special guest. And today with us is Precious Brady-Davis. She is an award-winning diversity advocate, communications professional, and public speaker. For several years, she served as the Assistant Director of Diversity Recruitment Initiatives at Columbia College Chicago, her alma mater, and Youth Outreach Coordinator at Center on Halstead, the largest LGBTQ community center in the Midwest. But you may likely know her as an entertainer on the stage. You may have seen her on a show or two on TLC, or you might also know her from her fierce and important advocacy work in the LGBTQ community. And I'm honored to have you with me here today. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Matthew. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So I have a copy of your amazing book with me. One of the things was so beautiful, it reminded me a little bit of my sort of literary icon, Maya Angelou. And the reason why I say that is that you were able to talk about very difficult subjects in a way that was surprisingly and shockingly not judgmental towards the situation, towards the people. It was full of compassion for not only yourself as a person who was in a challenging situation growing up, but also the people around you. And so there was this objectivity to it that was at one point like brought tears to my eyes. So thank you, for bringing that in just a wonderful way. So the title is I Have Always Been Me. And I'm curious the title, where that came from, and if you can share that, and then I'll kind of fill in with a question I have following up on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that humbling compliment. I think that is the highest bar, in literature to achieve. But I do want to just say real quick, as I was writing this book, I did revisit I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, just because Maya Angelou, so gracefully, she does tackle subjects of abuse in her book. She tackles subjects of abandonment, of being raised by her grandmother. And I thought there were a lot of similarities in our story. So Thank you so much for saying that. That is really an honor.
Yeah.
In terms of the title of this book, I Have Always Been Me. I Have Always Been Me is a declarative statement. It is a pronouncement. It is an honor of legacy. It is the truth that I have always lived my entire life. I think in particular today, folks are starting to have conversations around trans equality, as well as trans visibility, as well as conversations of gender and sexuality. And my whole life, I have been having this conversation without having the proper, academia, terms behind it, the proper academic terms.
Right.
And I've always been me. It is a celebration of the young child who turned a picnic table into a stage. It is the young person who fashioned a shinier mold for herself where one was not provided. It was the young child who left every space better than they found it. And this book, I Have Always Been Me, it is a celebration of the person that I have always been and the different iterations of me. And another reason the book is called I Have Always Been Me is I celebrate all of the iterations of Precious. You know, today in my modern life, so many people say to me, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. You know, and they flock to you in the good times. But I'm just as proud of the young kid who moved to Chicago with nothing and went to Chicago with heart and a dream, because I've always been larger than life. I have always been fearless. So I Have Always Been Me is a celebration of all of the iterations of Precious.
I love that, and I'll tell you, because one of the reasons, the reason where that question came from is on, I think it was page here it was on page 179 was the first time that you mentioned your birth name, which I thought was really interesting that it came so late. And so and then on the same page you said, I left that life behind, and I thought, oh, like, well, if you leave the life behind, that something new is coming. And then the way you just described that is this sort of iterative process of being you, but you're still always you, even in the different iterations. That was really a beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing that. And it also really leads to me one of the other things, and I'll say this is the main reason why I wanted to have you on the show. So Tapping Creativity, it's a show and a podcast about the creative process. And I've interviewed a lot of other, actors, directors, novelists, things like that. And when I first saw this come up, I thought, one of the things that we kind of forget is one of the canvases of our lives is our own self, right? And so I was like, oh, you, like, in getting to know your story was, what is that there was a creativity and a process that I'm sure was amazing in saying, how do I create the person who I am? Because we all know we come in, we're babies, right? We get a lot of who we become is put upon us by others. But then at a certain point, we actually have to stand up and say, yeah, this is the canvas, but now the way that I paint that canvas is all up to me. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that means to apply your creativity to yourself as your canvas.
My entire life, creativity has been the place that I found myself. It has been the place that I found healing. Creativity for me was almost like my first friend. It was a safe space for me. It was a space where I found imagination. As a kid, I was drawn to Tina Turner, Whitney Houston, and mimicked them from an early age. Jessica Rabbit. I was drawn to these performative women who took the world on with an authority. And then I'll never forget seeing the first theatrical production I ever saw of Alice in Wonderland. And I was so moved by the lights, the color of the lights, the tone of the first play I ever saw was Alice in Wonderland. And I remember that the queen in Alice in Wonderland saying, don't you dare, in such an authoritative tone that it was something that I mimicked the rest of my childhood. And then I later started performing in community theater. And it was a place that I found belonging outside of the world of trauma, that I was placed right in the middle of. Creativity for me was a place that I found healing. Singing in concert choir, it felt like I was in heaven, hearing the soaring melodies, and then it was another part of finding my voice. Right. It was another piece of my voice. Creativity is how I found my name. Creativity is how Precious comes about. And I didn't even know that is how I would name myself. When I performed drag in college, performing drag for me was the most liberating experience. And I talk about in the book of what shutting that stage door before walking on the stage to perform in drag for the first time. I felt like I was leaving a life behind. Performing drag freed me from the limitations that everyone else had placed upon me. Creativity for me is everything. And I think it is one of my life's talents. It has freed me in a way that I never knew. My creativity knows no limits. I'm always, and I think it is part of the ways in which I'm able to dream up a world not yet seen yet, because it is the world that has always been in my head. It has always been an inclusive, free world. I have always been drawn to color and light and bright things. And it is the essence of who I am.
Wow. All right. So with that, you talked about like performing in drag, and then you said at one point, female impersonation is performance art, and you wanted to perform that. And obviously it's performance art, but not necessarily obviously until someone says it. So thank you for saying it. It's one of those things, right? It's like the obvious is so obvious, but you don't see it. And then someone's like, oh yeah. And of course it's like, God, amazing performance, right? And you even mentioned at one point, like, this should be taught as an art form. And then you were just talking about that as the freeing. And so, it's interesting. The other thing that was fascinating to me is you used the term female impersonation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this idea of drag and female impersonation. Literally, like, why is that important? Why is that performance? Where is the creativity? Like, because I could very easily see we live in a world where one could easily argue against that. I won't, because I get it, but not everybody will immediately see that.
Absolutely. I'll start with drag as an art form. Drag is an art form because it requires study. And I think people don't see this when they see drag. You have to study lyric. You have to study pronouncement. When a drag performer is performing, they are performing every syllable. It takes a great keen ear to listen to the highs and lows of a song. When drag performers perform, they're telling a story. They tell a story through movement. And the reason why people are moved by drag is because that person is using their body and they bring the audience along with them. And it takes costuming. It takes makeup. It takes hair. It is.
But it's also a character, right? Right? Is that the thing? It's like.
It depends. Like, okay. Some folks do character drag. And okay. Drag is just like gender. Drag is on such a continuum on the ways in which people do it. To me, I took drag very serious. I was not a joke, I wanted to be a heartfelt performer, and I performed music, that had meaning behind it. I was extremely drawn to Whitney Houston, and like my life today, I took an inspirational route. Anytime I took the stage, it was beautiful ballads, it was wonderful Broadway songs. I kept it light and fun, but you do have, queens who take a camp route. You do have, queens who are dancers, and there is a wide continuum. And the reason that I say female impersonation is because a lot of drag is rooted in iconography, and in the iconography of famous divas: Judy Garland, Barbra Streisand, Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, Dolly Parton. I mean, the list is endless, and I can go on. And a lot of it is the study of actions of a performer. You know, if you ever see a Celine Dion impersonator, they're going to do every hand tick. They're going to kind of slightly bounce. You know, if you see a Dolly impersonator, you're going to see the big hair. You're going to see the big lips. That takes study, and that takes commitment. And when I say female impersonation, it is an homage. It is to honor. I think that drag also is the highest version of oneself. Anytime you put someone in drag, there will be attitude that comes out. There is a freedom that comes with drag. There is a releasing that happens. Drag is also, it's also a breaking of the rules.
Right.
You break all the rules.
And that, right. And in some ways, that is the key to really being creative, because if you're following all the rules, you're not, I mean, following rules is great, particularly if you want to, you know, if you're making a table and you've designed it and you know exactly how you want it, you've created a rule for it. But before you get to that point, the creativity and saying, how do you make a table that's fresh, or how do you do anything? It's that you actually have to break the rules. You have to try something that never existed before, right?
Absolutely. And I think you have to give the greatest honor to drag performers, because people are drawn to someone who isn't really singing. Mm-hmm. I mean, that takes spirit, that takes gusto. And I mean, folks now pay hundreds of dollars to go and see drag performers perform because of the level of talent to which drag has arisen in the ranks of society. And I think that, you know, RuPaul's Drag Race, you know, has obviously done that and has created a platform. And I do think that it should be taught. I think there's a lot to learn about being grounded. I think that's something that every artist should know. Art should come from a place of grounding, a place of centering, a place of connection. And I think that, you know, because I've done all kinds of art, you know, I've done musical theater performance, you know, I've done straight acting. And I think that there are things that you can transfer over. I think every creative should try drag once.
Well, I guess I know what I need to add on to my to-do list now.
Please, try it.
You just basically told me I haven't lived yet. Like, I've got to get my act in gear so I can actually do drag, so I can actually have arrived as a creator.
But then on the other hand, there is a philosophy that each of us are in drag, because we are all playing roles.
Oh, yes.
at times. And drag, the word drag itself literally translates to the word clothes. It means to put on. So what are we putting on when we enter the various spaces of our lives?
Wow.
We put on drag when we are with our families. We put on drag when we attend a church service. We put on drag when we go to the airport. So the ways in which we present to the world of what they want them to see, because drag is face. Like, you are projecting something for folks to see.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I was so attracted to in reading your book and learning your story and bring you on the show was exactly that. I feel like, you know, every time I go out into the world, and particularly as a cisgendered guy, I was definitely used to fall into that category of like, I don't really care what I wear. I mean, it's not that important. I'll just throw on whatever. Right. And it literally hit me when I was way too late in my life. It was actually when I met my fiance, and she was like, you have got to basically throw everything you own away, and we're starting over from zero. I love you, and I'm not going out with you looking like that. And I realized that that even if you kind of like don't care or just throw something on, that's actually, there's still a choice. It's not like I didn't choose what I wore. It's that I didn't give it any consideration, but there's actually even still a shocking amount of consideration that goes into not considering the way I appear in the world.
Absolutely. You are still making a statement. And I think one of the greatest depictions of that, there's a great scene in The Devil Wears Prada where Miranda Priestley, she berates Andy Sachs because Andy Sachs mocks a sweater and a cerulean belt. And she says to her, you think that the sweater that you're wearing, that you didn't make a choice, that you have nothing to do with the fashion industry, but you're wearing a sweater by the people in this room. Such a powerful statement.
And I think it's so important, right? And so to like actually bringing aware, and that when you talk about this kind of like, what do we put on when we go out into the world, we actually have a choice at a certain point. You know, when you're a kid and like, and you document this so beautifully as your process of kind of being, not becoming yourself because you always were, but uncovering yourself from the covering that was put on by society. And we all deal with that. We all do. Like, and, you know, also as a straight white man, like the amount of, stuff that's been put on me for how I'm supposed to be it's heavy. It's a big weight, and some of it may fit, but a ton of it really doesn't. And even more of it, you know, in the broader culture can certainly lead to pretty unhealthy ways of being. And so this thing that I think one of the things that I gathered from your book is actually how vital the trans movement is for the straight community, right? Like, I'm so grateful that there's a new sense of like an awakening on how my creativity can be put to use on myself through understanding your story and the story of what it means to be a trans person, period.
Thank you. So powerful. You know, I think that my whole life that I have had an optimism. I have been rooted in the core of my identity. You know, I remember as a kid going to see my biological mother on a visit. And I knew that my biological mother didn't want me. And I remember her playing with my sister at a visit. And I remember jumping back into the car with the social worker who brought us there. And I jumped in the car, slammed the car door, and looked up at the sun and said, I am going to show you, like my spirit, I remember thinking this, I'm going to show you that I'm going to be the most authentic version of myself. I am going to be the biggest spirit that you have ever known. And that went through my entire childhood of being myself. There were various moments throughout my childhood to which I articulated to adults around me, I want to be a girl. And I remember my grandmother saying to me, don't ever say that again. So long before, you know, we were having a mass conversation around trans identity, I identified as gender nonconforming and wielded those behaviors in navigating the world. In the book, I talk about wearing my sister's shoes, climbing up into her closet. I was drawn to those heels and clomped in them, you know, down the hall. And I think that there's such a great history when it comes to, I mean, the LGBTQ community in general, you know, that is not taught in schools. I mean, there's no reason, you know, that I should have to wait to go to college to learn about LGBTQ history, to learn that there was a great throng of folks who came before me who were great activists, who were bending the mold when it came to gender and sexuality. And we see the effects of that erasure.
Yeah.
We see high rates of suicide amongst LGBTQ youth. We see high rates of homelessness. You know, there is a lack of acceptance, and we see what becomes of it. And so for me, that's why it's so important for using creativity and using mediums like literature to empower folks, to tell the story of one's life and one's journey. Because when folks see someone doing something, they say, I can be that too.
Right. Yeah, it's too easy. And in our culture that where we sort of love the pioneers and the first, and we honor the first, but the reality is being the first is a freaking lonely place to be, right? Like, it's like nobody actually wants to be that hero. We actually want to be like, couldn't you just imagine? I mean, you're a trailblazer, but in some ways, like the life of a trailblazer, like you talk about this kind of this loneliness and this fight, and like, who am I, and trying to suppress yourself. Like, okay, great, you're a trailblazer, but it would awfully be nice. Like, I'll say that there's going to be some person coming behind you who's going to just be over the moon grateful that they didn't have to be a trailblazer. Like, I want a community. Right? We're human beings. We want community. We don't need to be the trailblazer. We don't need to be out there alone at the front getting the crap beaten out of us, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I never, like, that was not my intention in my life. I did not think that I was a trailblazer. I just set out to be my authentic self in spaces. I mean, I am grateful for the progress that I have seen. I could have never imagined that I could be a trans person in society, that what I was dealing with as a young person, where folks were looking at me like I'm crazy, is actually a thing.
Right.
know? That there is academic basis to that, and being the first. And I think people see the glamour of being the first.
Mm-hmm.
Being the first is hard because there's no road paved for you.
Right.
And that means sometimes you fall into pitfalls. That means sometimes you are going to be on a lonely road, and you are going to get hurt. And it's hard. It is so difficult because it's so lonely, because you're following your heart, and you're creating a path for yourself. You know, I talk about it in the book, what it was to be the first trans woman working at an LGBTQ organization.
Yeah, right.
I worked at an LGBTQ organization, transitioned on the job, and they refused to change my name in the email system because there was no protocol for that. And I had to deal with that because I was the first.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And someone else coming behind you is going to be so grateful. There's something else. There's something else you talked about in the book, and I'm going to mention it. But it was something that also what interested me before I got there, because kind of towards the end of the book, and when you first met Miles, right? And you were kind of like rejecting the idea of possibly being together. And I pulled this quote: "How would it even work to be with a trans man?" And this was kind of a key moment, like, how would it even work? Because I think one of the things that we forget is that we all have these implicit biases, and those keep us from being able to be creative, to actually think outside the box what is possible. And the fact that, like, you jumped to a conclusion that basically would, were it not for some intervention, you would have missed the love of your life because of the conclusion, right? Whereas this idea, like, right, we want the answer, right? We live in the information age. Give me answers. I want answers. I want answers. But creativity, whether it's in our own lives and how we live our lives, or whether it's in the work that we do as creatives, the the life, the creative force is not at all in the answer. It's in the question. So when you asked that question, what was so interesting to me was you said, how would it even work? The reality is you were saying in your mind, this won't work. Like you already had the answer, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I said there was no way that this would work, and I was already putting up barriers to my blessing, right. to love was right in front of me. Everything that I had ever asked for, my husband is the epitome of unconditional love. Love had presented itself right in the face, but because of the internalized stigma about trans bodies, like in particular, I had no clue about how it would work.
Right.
And I didn't need to. That was a thought that I didn't need to have. I was policing my own body in that moment because of the messages around gender, around heteronormativity that had been passed down to me. And once I was able to really put that aside and to honor, for starters, my own trans body, to honor of how I asked the world to see me in the fullness of myself, a full person, and not automatically think about sex in a situation, but think about the holistic nature of the situation. I was freed and found my soulmate.
Yeah. And I think that that's like really to me, that's so key in like life in general. And it was a big lesson that I got from the book. And I'm going to relate that back a little bit to what occurred to me as I was reading, because I know you as a woman. And obviously the first part of your life, the world did not see you as that. And so you're writing your experience, and regularly I was caught imagining you in my mind differently than you were at the age of 9 or whatever. And it's something that I totally loved was that you, in telling your story, you forced me to be creative in my thinking, to have to think outside the box, to shift, to get away from the normal patterns that I'm used to, right? I look at the cover of your book and I'm like, oh, well, that's whose book I'm reading. But when you were 9, this was not you. In fact, you had a different name then. And once again, I thought it was brilliant that you didn't actually mention your birth name until really late in the book. I went back, and maybe I missed it, but I went back several times. I'm like, no, and so therefore I was always reading Precious's story, but I had to really bend my brain to remember, oh, how does she appear in the world at this part of her story so that I can picture it? And I loved that. It was just beautiful.
Thank you. And that is absolutely intentional, because I am a trans person, and I wanted people to see the experience of what it is to be a trans child in the world. That is what it is. There is no label, That's why the book is, I have always been me. This is the person I have always have been, long before there was any kind of label for it. And I really wanted folks to see me. And that name that I had before, my dead name, it is scant in the book, because I didn't want people pulling the full association and just seeing the difference that there was 2 different people.
Right.
Because for me, I've always been precious. And people saw it long before I did. Yeah. I talk about that, like in the book, there was something different about me. Kids at school taunting me, saying, "Are you gay? You gay?" When I was in 4th grade, I didn't even know what gay meant. When I was in 7th grade, people would corner me in the hall at school and say, queer, you're queer. And I'm like, what? Like,
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. And now you're like, oh, well, bring it on. Yeah, bring it on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the fullness of that. But even in those moments, so proud to be that person, walking in my truth in my junior high school. Say what you want. This is who I am. This is the representation that I am presenting. And it's something that I still believe I do today. I change every space that I'm in. I leave it better than I found it. And in every room that I ever stepped in, I force people to think about, oh, she's different. There's something different about her. And I hope that it bridges the conversation, of me being from a place like Nebraska, where there are not huge models of trans visibility. You can't say that anymore.
Yeah.
Because there is. There's a precious Brady-Davis who came from Omaha, Nebraska. And you just can't say, oh, that's just as an urban story. That doesn't happen here. No. Because queer people are in places both rural and urban.
Right. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and those 2 questions are going to be things that you're going to have to read the book in order to understand them. So I'm going to ask the question, you'll get the answers, and then you have to go get Precious's book, I Have Always Been Me, and then you'll understand what these questions came from. So my first question is, do you still have the Yahoo email address?
Absolutely. I do transform my jaw. Oh, I won't say the whole thing, but yes, I do.
Okay, good.
Hilarious. Yeah, and I won't check it anymore, but I do still have that email.
All right. Well, just so you know, at some point, if you ever log back in, I'm definitely sending you an email to that today when we get off.
Please do. Please. Oh my God. Such a great story, right?
Yeah. So good. So good. So, and that's a nice little teaser. My other teaser is, well, this one, I'll give it a little bit away. You talk about every 4th of July, you make a 4th of July conclusion, as to, how am I doing this year? Am I happy? What do I need to change? Like, you take stock. We're just after 4th of July. So tell me, what was your 4th of July conclusion this year?
My 4th of July conclusion this year was I'm happy. I'm so happy where I am in my life. I love the work that I'm doing at the Sierra Club, benefiting the environment. I'm so proud. My book is published in the world. And I do think that there is another way to which I can be of greater service. And I talk about that at the end of the book.
Yes, so you do.
Will definitely have to read the book. So that is a part of my future considerations.
Love it. I absolutely love it. Well, thank you so much. This has just been so fantastic to get to spend some time with you. Again, for all of you watching and or listening, I Have Always Been Me is available now. I'd run out and get it if I were you, because as creative people in the world, which as human beings, that's one of our distinctions, is that we are creative, that this is an amazing story to really spark how creativity is ingrained in everything we do, from how we show up in the world, who we are, and what we create. So thanks for joining us.